Trump has changed sides effectively in the Ukraine war and is now really backing and supporting Putin and Russia rather than Ukraine, which is, after all, supposed to be an ally and a country which is maybe a faulty, but nevertheless a democracy. It's interesting to hear Trump talk about elections in Ukraine. I'd like to know when he thinks there was last a free and fair election in Russia.
President Donald Trump called Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky a dictator and criticized him for not holding elections during wartime.
When they want a seat at the table, you could say the people have to, wouldn't the people of Ukraine have to say, like, you know, it's been a long time since we've had an election. That's not a Russia thing. That's something coming from me and coming from many other countries also.
Well, that criticism comes directly from the Russian playbook. People have been pointing out one of Moscow's rationales for invading Ukraine is that Zelensky is an illegitimate leader. So how is Kremlin propaganda now coming straight out of the mouth of the US president? Well, let's welcome to the show Christopher Steele, former head of Russia desk at MI6. Christopher, good afternoon.
Hello there.
Christopher, what were your thoughts when you heard Donald Trump make that claim, specifically about the elections?
I think we'd seen it coming in a sense because it's something that Peskov and the Russians had been circulating for a few weeks, and the Ukrainians certainly were worried about it in advance. So in a sense, it was almost inevitable, but of course, to some extent shocking and or even comical that Trump is effectively the parrot for the Kremlin.
President Zelensky came back at that saying the President Trump is living in a disinformation bubble, if you like. How do you think these thoughts are coming to Donald Trump? Are there people who are close to him in the Oval Office feeding him those ideas? Is it stuff that he actually just reads and watches on TV? Where do you think he's getting his news?
I think probably from several sources. I think that Fox News and, of course, social media are flooded with Russian disinformation and Russian memes. But I suspect also that they're getting it directly through various contacts they've got with the Russians and with the Russian regime. Only this week, I think, his Middle East envoy said that he had been to Moscow and had formed a friendship, was the quote, with Vladimir Putin in the aftermath of that, which is quite shocking when you consider what this Russian regime has done and the fact that it has murdered people in the West and it's invaded a European country.
What do you think is the fascination that Donald Trump seems to have with Vladimir Putin? I mean, many people have been saying that he admires stronger personalities. He seems to be having more respect for leaders who are strong. Viktor Orban, again, very strong personality, a very strong leader in Hungary. What do you think is the connect between Trump and Putin?
I think that's part of it, but I think his attitude, Trump's attitude to Putin is unique. Trump has been pretty critical at times of Xi and Erdogan and other leaders who are claimed to be strongmen. But the situation with Putin is completely unique in my view and inexplicable. It's not at all clear what the US gets out of this. I mean, arguably, Donald Trump might be looking for a Nobel Peace Prize and other things. But also, of course, there's a big question mark over whether the Russians actually have leverage over him. And it's something that we've addressed in the past in our intelligence and reporting.
I mean, there are all sorts of theories that have been floating around, perhaps even some theories saying that not only compromised Trump, but a Trump that has actively been recruited by KGB. Surely that can't be the case. I mean, what are your thoughts on something like that? Crackpot theory, surely.
Yeah, that's a bit far-fetched, and of course it's always more complicated than that. One of the things the Russians have been good at in recent years is shifting from traditional espionage, if you like, which is the agent stealing the secret documents, to recruiting a sort of network of influence, agents of influence, people of influence in the West particularly, and in the media and in politics and in government and so on. And more subtly, I think, disseminating messages, memes and other things and propaganda, which have been kind of put into poisoned our water, as it were, in the West, in our news media. And you can see that things like Fox News now, there's barely a pretense of objectivity or facts there. It's just really spouting propaganda that fits a hard right agenda.
Last weekend, I spoke to Stephanie Babst, who was former Deputy Secretary, I think it was, of NATO. She told me she no longer saw Trump as an ally. Do you agree with that view? Where do you think Trump's allegiances lie right now?
I think Trump's allegiances lie with Trump and with what Trump perceives as his interests rather than necessarily what is in America's interests. I mean, arguably, Trump has changed sides effectively in the Ukraine war and is now really backing and supporting Putin and Russia rather than Ukraine, which is, after all, supposed to be an ally and a country which is maybe a faulty, but nevertheless a democracy. It's interesting to hear Trump talk about elections in Ukraine. I'd like to know when he thinks there was last a free and fair election in Russia, because I can tell you there hasn't been one for at least 25 years.
He seems to have changed his mind in the last few days, saying that President Zelensky should be at the table and perhaps have those talks with Vladimir Putin. But Christopher, we in the UK and certainly all across Europe have been talking about life without the reliance on the great American military might. Plenty has been discussed about lots of companies. We've seen Denmark immediately go to 3% of spending of GDP for their defence spending. But the question is that people have posed is that can Ukraine continue to fight off Russia without American support, even if they had the support of European countries militarily? Can that war succeed for Ukraine without US military intelligence, which is unique to the US?
I think probably not. I certainly don't think they can win the war without American support of some sort. And this is the dilemma that Zelensky and others face, which is clearly the Europeans, I think, have the sort of support them ideologically and otherwise, politically, but don't really have the military might in particular and military capability. I do think, however, that Russian capability is grossly exaggerated. And I believe that the Russian army has been severely depleted as a result of this war. And that's partly because of Ukrainian skills. I actually think the Ukrainian army is the most capable army now in Europe. It could probably teach us a thing or two. But I think that certainly going forward, without any sort of American support or capability provided in support of them, I think it would be extremely difficult to continue the war. Not impossible, but it'd certainly be very hard for them.
Christopher, we have got news in the last few hours that Donald Trump has fired the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, CQ Brown. He was the highest ranking officer in the country as part of a major shakeup of the top military leadership. What do you make of this? And is it usual to have a president replenish or replace that top brass when it comes to the military?
I don't think so. I think in general what happens is that the military top brass serves out its time and then is replaced perhaps by somebody who is favoured more by the sitting president. But I think that's quite an alarming change to take out the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and also the head of the Navy, I believe, has also been replaced. So it looks very much like Donald Trump is bringing into high office and into the key jobs in American sort of security and defense the people that he thinks he can rely on for total loyalty to him rather than loyalty to the Constitution. And I think we may get to the point where, senior military officers are left with the prospect of obeying or not orders which are palpably illegal, and that will create some kind of crisis.
I mean, it's important to say that the US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth had previously said that CQ Brown should have been fired because of his woke focus on diversity, equity and inclusion programs in the military. Do you think that's why he's gone?
No, I think he's gone because he's not entirely loyal. He's more loyal to the Constitution than he is to Donald Trump. I think Trump judges people purely by the degree of loyalty they show to him and also the degree of sycophancy they display. And I think that's one of the big problems that we've got going forward, particularly, the likes of Keir Starmer and Macron, is that if they don't sort of stroke Trump's ego, it's going to be very difficult to achieve anything with the United States going forward. And that's a frightening prospect.
I want to get your thoughts, Christopher, on the appointment of Kash Patel as head of the FBI. His confirmation went ahead by 51 votes to 49. 2 Republican senators voted no. The main concern was a worry that he might seek retribution against Trump's enemies. He has referred to, as law enforcement officials, he had referred to them, the ones who investigated Donald Trump, as criminal gangsters. What do you make of Patel's appointment as the head of the FBI?
I think it's deeply shocking. I think he's entirely unqualified for it. And an organization like the FBI, which is probably the preeminent law enforcement agency in the world, and don't forget, conducts a lot of operations and work abroad, needs to be led by somebody who is, loyal to its staff, loyal to its aims, and loyal to the Constitution. And, I could sit here and talk about Kash Patel for probably an hour about the ways in which he doesn't fit that mold. And quite apart from anything else, he's an election denier in regard to 2020. He thinks the 2020 election was stolen from Donald Trump. He was criminally referred by the Justice Department for allegedly the misuse of intelligence documents and misdistribution of them, and so on. And Gina Haspel, who was the head of CIA, director of CIA in the last Trump administration, threatened to resign if Kash Patel was imposed on her in the agency. And so you can see how this man is not somebody that we should be doing business with, really, or we can do business with going forward. And this is going to be a big problem, I think, for our own government.